kept a very, very low profile. We started working with a lawyer, a guy called John Wadham, who was head of the Human Rights Agency in the UK, an organisation called Liberty. He represented us. I went back to the UK after a month because I knew I did have to pack up the flat, sort out our affairs, and I knew I would be arrested. But at that point, I hadn't really said anything about intelligence, so I didn't think I would be prosecuted if I had to take the risk. And it's a very, very difficult feeling to hand yourself voluntarily into custody. And I knew I was going to be arrested at the airport when I landed. I was being accompanied by my lawyer. And of course, they started the usual spiel, you know, you're being arrested under the Official Secrets Act. And then they said, and we're arresting you under the Criminal Justice Act. I was like, my God, what else have I done? Turned out that I was an international money launderer. I didn't know. Nobody told me. Basically, what happened is David and I took some expenses from the newspaper to go on the run, and we had a joint bank account. So that made me an international money launderer. That proceeds of crime or whatever went into my account. Anyway, I got arrested, was taken to the terrorism suite in the police station at Charing Cross in London, and was grilled for that day. They'd gone through the flat, obviously. They'd found various love letters David and I had written. Had great time reading that out to me, trying to break me. Then they did release me without charge, but kept me on police bail for 6 months. And then I had a week to pack up the flat when I really realised the full magnitude of what they'd done to our home. David, in the meantime, had gone and holed up in a little French farmhouse in the centre of the country, very, very remote area called La Creuse. And I joined him there about a week later, and it was primitive and remote. We had no car, because of course that would be too easy to trace. No television even, so we had to do a lot of talking, a lot of reading. And it was freezing cold. We were there for 10 months while we tried to negotiate with the government. We tried to say to them, look, we've got all this other evidence of criminality on the part of the spies. Please take it from us. Let us come back to the country and give you this evidence to investigate. And they kept refusing. They kept refusing. So in desperation, this was in 1998, David decided to set up a website, Shayla.com. And he was going to publish carefully details of things like the Gaddafi plot to try and bounce an investigation. He also decided to use, through the injunction, a route to disclose that information in the national press. So at the end of July 1998, we went up to Paris to meet the journalist to do the story. And this is when the spies got really frightened. They didn't want this information to come out. And this is when they arrested him and tried to extradite him from France. Now, fortunately, we were up in Paris, because if we'd been holed up in Creuse, I'd be absolutely stuck in the middle of nowhere. But we were there, and we sort of knew, you know you're being followed, you know something isn't quite right, your hackles are up. So one night when we met the journalists, we said, look, we've got to get out of this hotel, move to another one, let's just keep moving around, we don't want to be caught. Even so, I think they tracked us through his mobile phone, and David went out one day to watch, I think it was a football match on Sky TV in one of those English bars in Paris. And it was a pre-season friendly, and his team lost again, so he wasn't in the best of moods. And he was on his way back to the hotel and rang me and said, I'll be there in 10 minutes, and we'll go out for some food. So I'm waiting in the hotel room, and there's a knock on the door, and I think, great, he's forgotten his key again. But it wasn't. I sort of opened the door. 3 very scruffy counter-terrorism officers from the French DST, the equivalent of MI5, were standing there. And they said, we have Monsieur Shayla. We want his identifying papers, his passport. He didn't have it with him. What he'd done was he'd sent them up to get the passport, knowing it wasn't there, because that way at least I would know what had happened to him. If he hadn't done that, he would just have vanished off the streets. And in fact, I didn't see him again for another 2 months, because they put him under very stringent secrecy laws in the French prison, because the British government said he was some traitor selling secrets to an enemy power. No, he wasn't. He was a whistleblower trying to expose crime on the part of MI5 and MI6. Anyway, he was in prison for 4 months almost in total, and everyone thought he would be extradited. But the French, bless them, said what he had done by blowing the whistle was manifestly a political offence, and they did not extradite people for that sort of activity. It was quite a stressful day, shall we say. There was a sort of choice going into the courtroom. Either he would be extradited, in which case he'd be sent straight back to the UK, held on remand in a high-security prison for 2 years, and then convicted, or he'd be released that evening. So, a bit of a stressful situation. as I said, thank you to the French, they released him, and we had one hell of a party. It was great. Anyway, just to fast forward a little bit, I'm conscious of the time moving on. We spent another 2 years living in Paris after that, continued to campaign around exposing the criminality of the spies. And in that time, we saw friends and family being arrested as well. The ripple spread out. We saw a student who'd come over to interview David for her student newspaper being arrested under the Treason Act in the UK, hauled out of her lecture theatre by special branch police officers. We saw journalists being convicted around David's case as well. So it was a big ripple effect. They were desperate to keep what he had secret. After 2 years of really pushing it as far as we could go, we decided to go back to the UK voluntarily. And again, big media hoo-ha. But we thought, you know, the Human Rights Act had come in. There is a guarantee of freedom of expression now in the UK law. Well, there is for most people perhaps, but not for intelligence officers or former intelligence officers. David expected to be put on trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act within 6 months. After all, the police had 3 years to do their investigation. What more did they need to do? But they insisted on hauling us through a whole series of pre-trial hearings designed to make sure that by the time he came to trial, he couldn't say anything in his own defence. In fact, it was pretty much a kangaroo court. The judge ordered the jury to convict him, which just breached all basic case law in the UK. He wasn't allowed to freely question his accusers. Any cross-examination of MI5 officers who came to accuse him was vetted by the prosecution and by the judge and crossed out. So it was pretty much a kangaroo court, and inevitably he was found guilty. But the thing that concerned me in a way even more, I mean, you know, we'd done the prison experience before. You know, do it once, you can do it again. But the thing that concerned me more was the way the press was manipulated in all this. Because I was sitting in the courtroom when the judge gave his formal judgment, and he said, you know, he accepted that Mr. Shayler had done what he'd done in the public interest. There was no venal motivation, no lives were put at risk. So imagine my surprise when I looked at the papers the next day and all the headlines said, Shayler sells agent lives down the river for money. It's like, hang on, are they just crap at taking down shorthand or something? I just didn't know, I didn't get it. But looking at it now, I mean, having had a lot more experience of working with the media in the UK, the mainstream media is so under control, not just from the government spin doctors, but also from the spies themselves. There's even a section in MI6 which is called Information Operations, which is designed to manipulate the media. It can plant fake stories to create a trail in the media. It can spin stories. It can react to stories and say, no, of course that's all rubbish, don't believe it. And we see this again and again. I mean, if we saw this in the run-up to the Iraq War in the UK, there were screaming headlines saying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, primed to go off in 45 minutes and kill UK people. So we had headlines saying 45 minutes from doom, which came straight from MI6 and the government. Whereas, of course, that's all now been proven to be absolute rubbish. So I think this is a real problem as well in our democracies, because we are looking at a situation where we have the government, we have the spy agencies, and we have the fourth estate, the media, who are supposed to hold these people to account, but who are now part of that charmed circle. I can see very clearly how it's manipulated as well, because the journalists have to take the briefings, take the stories, in order to get the copy in the newspapers to keep their jobs. So this is where I think, you know, the internet can revolutionize how we approach these sort of issues. You know, we don't use the mainstream media anymore. Nobody trusts it. Everyone knows it's just the mouthpiece of the government, which again is another sign of a totalitarian state. Anyway, so that's a bit of our sort of story in terms of what we went through. But I think its continuing relevance now is what we're up against, because it's manifestly obvious that the spy agencies haven't reformed, haven't learnt from these lessons, and in fact are growing stronger and better resourced as the years go by because of this unending war on terror. And this is something that we do need to address, because we have agencies that are operating outside any democratic control. There is no real accountability, certainly in the UK, over the spy agencies. There is one committee that sits in Parliament called the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is allowed to question them about finance and management issues. That's it. So, you know, they have an operation that goes wrong, they engage in criminality, there's nobody that can hold them to account. The media won't do it because they're being controlled and spun by the spy agencies. Who is going to do this? And we really do need to think about this, because obviously we've had the illegal war in Iraq. and the illegal war in Afghanistan, predicated on the terrible events of 9/11. And we're probably looking at another war, because we know they want to go into Iran, not just for the oil, but from the very fact that the oil is being traded more increasingly in euros, not dollars, which is another major problem for the American economy. So we have to be very vigilant, I think, because we're seeing under this war on terror a basic wholesale erosion of our freedoms, certainly in the UK, and I would assume pretty much across Europe, especially from that awful story, the terrorist story the other day. We have a situation where all our basic rights are being shredded in the name of protecting us against this nebulous Al-Qaeda threat. Of course, we all know Al-Qaeda was sort of funded and trained initially by the CIA and MI6 at least. So what are we looking at in the UK? We have had extraordinary rendition flights, torture flights, stopping off and refueling in our country. We have had the introduction of biometric ID cards imposed on us against everyone's wishes. They're going to be rolled out next year. We're looking at a whole slew of new counter-terrorism, anti-terrorism laws. Even the idea, for example, that in the old days, at the height of the IRA campaign, you could only hold and question without charge a terrorist suspect for 7 days. And that has been increased already to 28 days, and the government wants to push it up still further. Now, why? I mean, we're a real threat from the IRA. Al-Qaeda, less so really in the UK. We have other laws as well. There's Serious Organised Crime and Police Act, which means we now cannot protest outside our House of Parliament. You have to get written permission to do that, give them 6 days' notice. But there are ways around that. We all go and protest on our own now, if that's a possible thing. There are other laws as well that have come into the UK. Something called the Civil Contingency Act, which came into power in 2005, which basically means that any minister can sign a piece of paper which means that they can enforce a state of emergency in our country. So they can quarantine us in a certain area. They can stop us moving freely around our own country. They can stop us having political meetings. And they can even seize our homes and demolish them for national security reasons, and then not pay a penny compensation to the homeowner. This law just went through. It was whipped through the House of Commons. Nobody questioned it at the time. Nobody questioned it in the media. And it's there now, and we can't do anything about it. But the really bad one that they keep trying to bring in is something called the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Bill. And this has become nicknamed the Abolition of Parliament Bill for obvious reasons, because nobody can ever say it. But they tried to push this law through in January 2006. It was booted out by the House of Lords, which is not usually the sort of bastion of freedom and democracy in our country. But under the terms of this law, we're looking at any government minister, again, just by stroke of a pen, can overturn any previous law enacted by our House of Parliament, by our democratic representatives. This shreds 700 years of hard-won democracy in the UK, and they want to try and force it through again. Gordon Brown's Labour government is going to try and reintroduce it to the House of Parliament. There's a big campaign against it, so have a look at it on the internet, the Abolition of Parliament Bill. If this goes through, we will be living in a police state. There is no doubt about it. So this is why we do need to sort of start thinking very deeply about how we can hold the spies to account, what we can do to counter them. Because contrary to the myth, and I hope I've probably showed to a certain extent, they are not all competent, all-knowing James Bond figures. Quite often they are quite plodding individuals. And if you rock the boat and you ask questions and think laterally, you are branded a maverick and a subversive. And many of us left for those reasons, should we say. But we need to band together, really. We can't rely on the mainstream media to hold these people to account anymore. We can't rely on the governments to rein them in, because the Labour government seems intent on increasing the resources and the powers and the staffing levels of the spy agencies in the UK. They want to make sure that there is a surveillance society out there. And yes, of course, at the moment, the communities that are being targeted are the Muslim community. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was the Irish community. But that obviously isn't going to remain the case. Again, as we heard from that harrowing terrorist story, they are coming for more and more and more of us. And, if you're involved in civil liberties or left-wing politics or hacking community or whatever, we are all going to be increasingly at risk because we will be deemed to be dissidents. So this is a time where we do need to band together. And, what a privilege to be amongst people with such a skills base, such a knowledge base, who can fight back and try and subvert what these people are doing to our countries. So please, as I said, have a look at some of these issues and do start thinking about them, because as Pastor Niemöller said, first they came for the communists and I was not a communist, so I didn't